I'm afraid to use the word mental health because I have no idea what the other person is thinking when I say that word.
Rather than classifying the world into people with and without things, the right way to ask, describe someone is, how much of something do you have?
All the social media guys seem to understand that if they touch that ugly nerve within us, it generates more interaction.
So in my mind, there's so much negativity on the internet because I'm only seeing it from now.
Is it true that if these two fingers are the same length, then you're more likely to be a serial killer, just as a professional?
I can remember very clearly a time when if I had to tell someone I was a psychiatrist, the reaction of people around me would be, you're analyzing me, or just simply moving away from me.
Hi, Vikram and Imran. Thank you for coming here and being on the podcast. Call me hopeful because I'm hopeful. There's a lot of information, misinformation, oversimplification, and then overcomplication of a lot of concepts and things that we talk about in regards to mental health on the internet. And the show is meant to be a place where I can discuss those things with various different people to see if we can break it down, understand the context and the concept, and then see what we can actually do about it in our real lives instead of just theoretically discuss them. And that's why this pilot is so important, because today I wanted to discuss the pros and cons of the rise of awareness in mental health, because there's been a huge spike in the awareness about the subject. Awareness is a good thing, generally speaking, and the internet is a great tool to spread awareness. It's also a vast, uncensored space. So the discussion I'd like to have today is it doing more harm or is it helping the cause? I wanted to speak to you, Vikram, because you've been in the mental health space since the 1990s. Awareness and affordability and accessibility has been your thing, from Sangath to the global mental health movement. And Imran, because you have lived experience with mental health struggles. Your mom is a therapist, so you had that influence growing up as well as you moved into the internet era. Lots of people in our family have mental health issues.
And lots of people in everyone's family.
Lots of people in everyone's family has mental health issues. And you've also had an intimate relationship with the internet in terms of your profession. Also, you're probably the most efficient user of the internet in terms of gathering information that I know. He has learned how to tie Boy Scout knots and all sorts of strange,
The internet is a great repository of information.
fun
If you want to learn
things.
something.
Yeah. So to start with what it looked like before, if you could tell us, Vikram, what the need for awareness was before the internet and what the fight for you and your colleagues looked like.
So let me tell you, I can remember very clearly a time when if I had to tell someone I was a psychiatrist or I worked in the space of mental health, the reaction of people around me would be either, getting a little nervous, giggling in that kind of nervous way, saying things like, oh, I better be very careful of what I say because you're analyzing me, or just simply moving away from me. It was like a conversation stopper. That is what it used to be like. And the fact that we're sitting in the studio here talking in this kind of way, this kind of frank, open way about a subject that used to be so imbued with fear and shame, I think can only be seen as a good thing. So I'm delighted that there has been more awareness.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the mental health space looked like before we had this awareness from a user point of view?
Well, I mean, from the user point of view, the mental health space was entirely biomedical. It was a very, very narrow medical approach. In fact, when you talked about mental health, you were really talking about mental health problems, mental disorders, as defined by medicine. The automatic corollary of that was that you were pagal. I mean, honestly, that's what it was, because in the public image, mental health, which was mental illness, which was being crazy, which was you would be carted off to an asylum, most of which were built during the Raj and hadn't changed at all since then. That is the imagery. And by the way, that was also the imagery in cinema at the time. So it was the public imagery of mental health. And from that moment to where we are now is a complete transformation. And if you're to ask me what is the single most important reason we've had that transformation, is because of the lived experience. So I'm really again, having Imran sit here and you introducing Imran in the way you just did, I cannot even imagine this happening in the 1990s. Because for Imran, it would have meant the end of his career. So I think this is something really positive. And why is it positive? Because it means that we can all come take mental health out of the shadows. And when we talk about mental health, we can talk about things in a positive way, because for me, mental health is like physical health, right? It's a statement that is positive. It's a strengths-based statement. And we have to rescue that word from what it used to be, which is a deficit, sickness, disease, drugs, doctors. That is what we have to actually rescue the term from. And I think that's what I think the conversation today is partly about.
Yes, that's the goal. I'm hopeful. And Imran, you're a 90s kid. You were there with when did the internet start?
Late 90s is when it started to become ubiquitous. I remember I got my first email address, a Hotmail email address, in late 97, I guess, early 98. That's around the time that everyone was starting to get online. You'd get an email address. We used ICQ chat back then. It's not around anymore.
I don't know what that is. Okay. So you've been around from the inception of the internet, and I think you've, been part of the internet's journey as it's progressed. Have you noticed any change from, Reddit trails to film to society to social media?
Yeah, tremendously. It is a kind of an extension and a reflection of society, of all of us. There are, of course, extremely dark and toxic corners of the internet till today. But I feel like that was much more the case in the early 2000s. It again reflected cultural norms and how everyone perceived it. There has been kind of a growth and change in online behavior as well, I think, in the last decade, where earlier on there would be much more toxicity, and certainly we have that today as well. But you will have much more. And again, I mean, I'm online a fair bit. I spend a lot of time on Reddit. That's kind of my internet forum of choice. And you will see the conversations often shifting, and people kind of approach things from a gentler perspective, from the perspective of, hey, let's try and be understanding. Let's not rush to judgment. Be curious, not judgmental. So yeah, there is definitely a lot more of that. It is something that we can all perceive. The fact that we are talking about it so much more openly and with compassion, rather than from a perspective of that guy's crazy. Like, hey, listen, we're all trying to heal.
Mm-hmm.
That has been a nice change.
I can see that also in the media.
Yeah.
The media, seriously, back in the 90s and before that, stories about mental health was always against stories about crazy.
Yeah.
And I think from then to today, I think actually the media has made such a transformation. Generally speaking, stories about mental illness are so much more compassionate, to use your word. That's exactly right.
I think it's really interesting that you guys see this change from a more bird's eye perspective than, say, I do. So in my mind, there's so much negativity on the internet because I'm only seeing it from now.
That is present and has always been present. What was not present and is now present is the other side of it, the compassion and the positivity. Earlier on, the bulk of it was weighted more negative. And suddenly now you will hear positive voices and you're like, hey, this is a new voice. I didn't see these voices before.
So also I would draw a distinction. I think what you're referring to is not the internet as a platform, but actually social media as one of the facilitators of conversation which use the internet as a platform. So, for example, if I see the internet in its broader sense, that could include me going to Google and just typing in a search, give me some suggestions on how I can manage my difficulties with my eating. Let's get that as an example, and you get a ton of different results. And I think actually that's a very powerful way of then getting information. You can choose the information you want, etc. I think what you're referring to is something quite different. I think so, and correct me if I'm wrong, is about social media. And I do think there are spaces in social media that can be very harmful to your mental health. In fact, we have very good evidence on that. I don't know whether either of you saw the latest report from Amnesty about how TikTok, for example, has intentionally engineered its algorithms to suck young people into a web that actually takes them into more and more toxic content to do with their mental health. So, for example, if I typed in something about, let's say, diet, within a few clicks, I will land up in a space which will basically tell you how to lose weight in extremely toxic ways.
Yeah, I did in fact see this thing, and they tend to drive it always towards negativity, towards radicalization. So whether it is from a health perspective, it will be this thing. In gender spaces, it will drive men towards kind of the what is called the manosphere, this kind of the toxic red pill space. In all spaces, because they find that, I guess, that increases their engagement. That rage bait is what they call it, the ugly part of you. All the social media guys seem to understand that if they touch that ugly nerve within us, it generates more interaction. You touch more, you click more, you swipe more. If they're stroking the ugly part within you, it's horrifying and terrifying.
Well, one positive thing I will say is that the world is waking up to this. Legislators, in the West at least, are beginning to call these companies to account. About 30-odd states in the US have filed a class action suit against a number of social media companies about the fact that they deliberately continue to let children open their own independent social media accounts, even though it is actually not allowed. It's a little bit like an alcohol company deliberately selling alcohol to a minor. And so the social media companies are being told, you cannot do this and you will soon be held legally accountable if you don't stop.
I've been anticipating that and kind of hoping we would reach a place like this where social media and kind of this digital stuff would be managed and regulated in the way that tobacco or alcohol or, like driving a car. All of these things have restrictions in place. All of them are regulated basis your maturity, basis your capability, so on and so forth. And while it is it's a bit of a minefield to venture into, I do believe that some manner of management and regulation is required within that industry. Yeah.
The examples you give actually are such relevant examples in this conversation. If we recognize that the brain is a work in progress, particularly in late childhood and early adolescence. We recognize this developmentally, and as a consequence in public policy, the implications are, for example, we do not let a child consume alcohol. We do not allow a child to light up a cigarette. We do not allow a child to drive a car.
Yeah.
To use examples you gave.
Yeah, exactly.
This is part of everyday life. Every society accepts it. I don't think it's a huge leap from that to say we should not have 11-year-olds and 9-year-olds opening their own Facebook accounts.
Yeah.
I don't just mean social media. I do also mean the internet in general. And I agree fully. The internet is a great tool to get all of this information out to the people who otherwise may not be able to get it in any other way. But even the general internet space does have, like you said, right? It's still a reflection of our general mindset, which still has articles like 5 steps to self-awareness. And I was actually thinking about this myself. Now in the leadership space, everyone is like, self-awareness is a very important leadership quality that you have. And so now all these degrees and corporate spaces are pushing self-awareness as a skill to have if you want to be a leader. Now, one way of looking at it is you can't become self-aware in 5 steps. that's really not how it works. It's a process. So you have thousands of people reading these articles, thinking in these 5 steps they're going to become self-aware individuals. However, my flip side was that so many people are reading about this. 5 of them will become actually self-aware and they'll actually do the work. So it's like this, go ahead, make gimmicks out of self-awareness if that helps you spread it across thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. The idea of just communicating a notion publicly, putting it out and letting it enter into the public discourse. While it may not be perfect, while it may even be flawed, at least it is adding to the public discourse. And from there on out, it will start to become more normalized. The awareness about it will start to grow. I think it is kind of like any societal change. You go back and you speak of, say, the women's rights movement or civil rights or gay rights, and any kind of an attempt to march forward collectively as a society. You will have starts and stops. You will have things that maybe are attempting to move forward but that are flawed and incomplete. But ultimately, they're all building blocks to move forward. You don't want to diss any of these things. Say, okay, it's small, it's incomplete, it's not perfect, but the intent is correct. Support it.
Yeah, I agree with Imran, but also equally, I see where you're heading with this also. I do worry a little bit about the dumbing down sometimes of discourse on the internet, not just about mental health, about many issues, really, but in the space of mental health, the danger. I'll tell you the word that I heard in a lecture I was giving a week ago for the Medical Pastoral Association. One of the attendees at that lecture, Nirmala Srinivasan, who's a very passionate caregiver of a person with mental health problems. She used the word, the vulgarization of mental health. And, I'd never heard it before, but I immediately twigged what she was referring to. And it was this kind of idea that the conversations about mental health have become so protean and so diverse that actually nobody knows what we're talking about anymore. And from her caregiver perspective, it also meant that the suffering of her child, who was living with a mental health problem, was being trivialized. That was what she meant, that there is something very profoundly difficult when you live with a mental health problem or you're caring for someone that should not be trivialized. And so I think that's what she was referring to. And maybe I don't know if that's what you're talking about. Certainly I find sometimes the internet, when you type in, let's say, something to do with mental health, you often get stuff that is actually quite vacuous. It's like makes it feel like you could be reading someone's kind of, wellness farm advertisement, come for a week, spend a lot of money and we will cleanse you up. So that has a place. I'm not denying that has a place, but somehow that is being conflated also with more substantive discussions about what makes our mental health good, what do you do when it's not so good, etc.
Yeah. So I read this article called, "Is Anything Trauma?" And it's a controversial thing to say, but, we have to also have that conversation that yes, great, let's talk about this. Essentially what you're saying, right? You trivialize because it's a spectrum, but you have to fully realize that it's a spectrum when you're using these words, but we don't necessarily have less intense words for the less intense feelings.
How do you club it all in? And how do you
we're trying to club it, we're trying to not. So I actually have some comments that are from the internet about what people have said, and just wanted your
comments on the internet,
thoughts on them. Sometimes therapy is great for people. Other times it gives people a new toolbox to emotionally manipulate people.
I think the word therapy is also one that's been over and often improperly used. What is therapy? It's a black box here, and a lot gets passed, for what is not really therapy as therapy. And I think that any therapy that, teaches you skills that are going to actually harm others isn't therapy in my book. It's like something else. Whatever it is, it's not therapy. Because therapy is supposed to be self-directed. It's supposed to actually help you deal with the difficulties that, we encounter in our lives rather than actually use it for, awful things to do to others. So, but I think this has a larger issue, which is we were touching about the internet. You type in something to do with mental health. You get so much information. There is no filter. And, it's hard to tell if you're not a person who has a scientific or a grounding in the field. It's hard to tell what's true and what is fake. And that, I think, is a problem with the internet.
Yeah, I'm afraid to use the word mental health because I have no idea what the other person is thinking when I say that word. So I say it, like everyone asks me, oh, what do you work in? And I'm like, mental health, but can I explain?
Yeah. So a lot of it is appropriated and then just tossed around. I hear the phrase gaslight being thrown around so much now. And you're like, okay, while that is a real and a valid thing, is everything gaslighting? Is something that I disagree with, someone tells me something that I disagree with and I push back, is this gaslighting? So there is such a thing, I think, as a lot of this stuff being appropriated and overused.
Masochistic personality disorder. Oh God, it's me.
Okay.
So this for me was kind of like self-diagnosing. It's a framework. And the framework will tell you all the possibilities. But that's why you need a psychiatrist to sit with you on whatever you're going through to actually be able to interpret it correctly for you. Because otherwise, you read a bunch of things and they sound like parts of you, which everybody has parts of everything in them, right? People are trying to educate the public about what this disorder is, what it looks like, what the symptoms can be. But then on the flip side, you have other people reading it and going like, oh, I have that.
I have these 7 disorders.
I did that I read one thing and I went to my therapist and I was like, oh my God, I have that thing. And she was like, okay, but that's not really the point. Let's think about why you behave like that and not figure out whether you have that disorder.
Is it true that if these 2 fingers are the same length, then you're more likely to be a serial killer? Just as a professional,
we can do a scientific study on that. But it's not the internet that's at fault here. Actually, it's the whole idea that you can classify people, pigeonhole and categorize people into these artificially constructed groups. You have this disorder and you don't, which completely deny the fact that you have just rightly pointed out that everything is a dimension, it's a spectrum, and all of us have a little bit or a lot of every single trait. And rather than classifying the world into people with and without things, the right way to describe someone is, how much of something do you have? And is that something affecting your daily life in a way that is harming you or other people around you? These are far more meaningful ways of having conversations about people than saying you have this disorder.
Do you guys have any very specific pros and cons that you all would like to bring up about this spike in awareness?
For my part, cannot think of a significant negative shade to it. There are negatives and positives, but to me it does feel like a broadly, largely net positive movement is how I've seen it.
Yeah, I agree with Imran. I think if we remember where we started from, if you think of it as a pendulum, sometimes the pendulum does have to swing a lot in the other direction in order to come to the right place. The only con, and I don't think it's directly because of the greater awareness, is that the needs of people with very severe, enduring mental illness have somehow been still obscured. The conversations that are focused on mental health are very welcome. They recognize that all of us have mental health. They recognize that in our everyday lives, that mental health can be affected in ways that we sometimes need support and help. But we should also be mindful that amongst all of us, there are a few of us who have very enduring mental health conditions. We should not be forgetting that there is, in fact, a group of people who are very vulnerable.
I wanted to bring up the aspect of agency and affordability and accessibility, because now we have so much information on the internet. Me as someone going to a therapist or a psychiatrist can actually have the words to ask them questions that I otherwise previously would not have been able to ask them. So I would have to just blindly believe what it is they're telling me. So in that sense, we have agency, we have a sense of community. We don't have a lot of mental health professionals in the country yet. So it's,
It's
closing,
still fledgling, sadly.
still helping us close that gap. So I think the pros are there and they're great. There are some complicated and gray area cons that I wanted to just get your opinions on. A lot of people are talking about the placebo effect, when people are like placeboing themselves with distress and then showing symptoms because they're thinking that they are that.
I think that's perfectly possible. The placebo effect is used in a very positive way, actually, not in a negative way. The placebo effect simply says that due to reasons other than something very biological in some kind of treatment you're receiving, you got better. Just because you had faith or you believed in what the physician was telling you or the psychologist was telling you. What you're talking about is the opposite, the nocebo effect, it's called sometimes, which is that you can almost will yourself through listening or reading about things, symptoms. For example, let's take COVID as an example. I actually think that the enormous amount of stuff that came out about long COVID, I'm not denying that long COVID exists, by the way, okay? But I do believe that a significant group of people who suffer these symptoms have also been influenced by the amount that they've read about things like brain fog, for example, that have actually also become something that they've got wrapped themselves into. That is not to say, again, I want to repeat that of course there are people who are suffering, and that suffering, just like the placebo effect, is also real.
Yeah.
But the mechanism through which it occurs is sometimes infected by not the virus, but by actual misinformation that is on the internet. I wanted to say one more con. It came to me when you were asking about cons. It struck me that a lot of the mental health conversations we're having right now push all the responsibility on your mental health onto yourself. I think there is a real danger of that. And that danger is to blame the victim for situations that arise that have actually nothing to do with the agency of the person. And I'll give you one very concrete example, which is to do with workplace. I do a lot of training on the area of workplace stress. And one of the most important messages I give people is that it's not you individually that is often the target of an intervention. It's the environment of the workplace. And if there's one thing that mental health science has taught us, is that our mental health is profoundly influenced by the social world, whether the social world is the workplace, the social media world, or the school if I'm a kid. And so we've got to be very balanced in our conversations in mental health to ensure that we don't displace the role of toxic environments and just put all the emphasis on the person.
Increasingly, modern society pushes a lot of the onus and the responsibility of all things, mental health, environmental health, all of these things are pushed onto an individual. There is not income inequality. It's because you're not working hard enough, you're not hustling, you're not working smart enough. That's why you're unhappy, or that's why you can't. Mm-hmm. So all of the onus tends to be pushed onto an individual responsibility rather than we are part of a whole system. We do have to look at it holistically, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's take one very concrete example, which is the mental health of groups that have historically been marginalized. One very good example would be sexual minority groups. How can you talk about the fact that sexual minority groups have a much higher risk of poor mental health in every form without acknowledging that it's not their sexual identity that is the problem? The problem is the way that they have been stigmatized or marginalized in different societies. It's incredible if you just say, you're from a sexual minority group, you're suffering from this significant impairment of your mental health, the solution is you should go for counseling alone. Of course, that counseling is important for that individual. But for those of us who are concerned more broadly with conversations about mental health, we have to also put the responsibility to society at large, or in some countries, governments, about the deliberate and intentional marginalization of minority groups.
It's all new. We're all still figuring out how to do this. And so there's been years of othering and years of stigmatization. So it's not like the people who are suffering right now have just started suffering, right? They've been suffering for a long time. So the patience that someone struggling has is gone because they've been struggling for so long. Now you can't expect them to have patience. But then on the other side, these people don't actually know what's going on. We're just learning about mental health. So there are a lot of people who actually just don't know how to help, know how to save you from complacency, but still support you. And then there's like this whole... Because your parents love you, but maybe they don't understand mental health. So now they're struggling to figure out how to help you. Not the internet, but the stuff we're putting on the internet is so pendulum swingy.
Mm-hmm.
So the question sort of is, what? It's complicated, right? That's the answer. It's complicated and we have to navigate it and figure it out. In your opinion, what would you think of is a useful step towards figuring out how to navigate this?
Navigate information?
Navigate information on the internet, because I feel like that's the content you're getting. And when you don't know what to do, that's the content that's sort of directing how you handle your in-person relationships, how you look at how hard you're working, what success is, what healing looks like, what is therapy, right? You're getting your content from there. And if you don't know, then that is what is swaying how you deal with things. So do you have any advice, any things to consider when you're sort of trying to navigate this space?
I've often wondered, whether there's a way to, for example, rate an information source on the internet on how trusted it could be based on, for example, criteria like, is the information contained here accurate? By that I mean, is it based on science? Is it equitable? Is it sensitive, etc.? Because right now, I don't think there is any way of telling. It's not just in the mental health space. I'd say this is true of many spaces, including, for example, the news. When I do searches, I don't get a sense of salience or reliability or trustworthiness. I have to make my own judgment. And obviously, because I'm in the mental health space, I know which website I'm going to consult. But for people who are not, I mean, it must be a baffling exercise figuring out, who do I trust here?
Yeah. So here we enter into a space where I think part of what is needed as a skill in modern society is media literacy. And here I am going to put the onus upon the individual. Because of the plethora of sources of information, the amount of stuff that is sent directly to your pocket all through the day, we're exposed to a whole lot of media with comments on the internet, with sources, as AI has risen, with AI-generated images, videos, all of this. More than ever, all of us need to increase our media literacy because it is easy to look at a single WhatsApp forward and just believe it. We need to have a greater amount of critical thinking, and there is no particular solution or fix to this other than time and a bit of investment from everyone to say, okay, am I going to believe the first thing that I read just at face value, knowing that this is the world we live in?
Maybe this is something we should be teaching everyone in school, right? I agree with you. How to sift fact from fiction.
Yeah, I think it is a vital skill for the modern world. This is from the level of school and parents to teachers. We need to be teaching people critical thinking and media literacy. It is a new skill.
You find lots of credible things on the internet. Do you want to give us just a glimpse of like how many websites do you read before you're like...
So you want to look at multiple sources. try and move outside of your bubble. All of us will tend to stay within a bubble that feels comfortable to us. I believe these kinds of politics, and I believe these kinds of genders, and I believe these sorts of things, and I don't like to move outside. You have to stretch that and say, okay, let me look at things outside of my bubble and try and glean from that. So more than a specific number or a specific source, you have to try and be a little open-minded, even when it's a little uncomfortable, and try and have a sense of, okay, don't be swayed by the emotion of it or confirmation bias because someone is saying something that feels right to me. Try to be a bit more open. That's how I try to approach the thing.
Do you have sites that you would like to tell us that you know for sure are valid so that...
But I'm not going to promote any one site, but what I will say is that what I tend to do is if it's a space that I know very little about, like, for example, I want to plan a holiday to a place I've never been to, I will almost always go to multiple sites and I will triangulate. Now, that's because that is my way of building confidence in myself. So, for example, if I read on one side that this particular place is, beautiful for X, Y, and Z reasons, I will then look at 2-3 other sites and see to what extent does that same information crop up there. And then I will use just a kind of a sense of, okay, many of the sites I'm visiting are saying the same thing about that place. I should trust this information. So I build a trust by looking at multiple sites. But I have the time to do that. I have the wherewithal. I have the media literacy, as it were, to do that. I don't think that we should expect that everyone out there has that, has all those resources. And I think we do need, in fact, to have a way of helping people cull information from the internet.
Especially in the mental health space, right? I'm already overwhelmed. I don't have the energy to...
Well, I mean, I think also Imran's point of confirmation bias. Because when you're in a vulnerable state, you already have formulated some understanding, right? The thing is that you could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to the internet, you'll certainly find a place where that information that is wrong will have a place for it. And, what you call confirmation bias, I think is one of the dangerous parts of the internet. It can confirm something that is not true.
Yeah. I'm feeling relatively decent about this conversation because y'all were so pro and I was like, okay, maybe I'm just too young to see the larger picture.
Yeah. I think the thing we were talking about right in the beginning of any kind of a social movement, any kind of a progression will have, it'll be an uneven graph, but as there is an intent to move towards growth and positivity. And on that journey, generally we move forward. We'll have detours, we'll have pitfalls, but collectively we're moving forward.
That is what I wanted to do with the show, right? At least what I've gotten from both of you is that it's not so dreadful. The blame element that gets put on the individual does not need to be there, but the accountability of putting in a little more effort into yourself and what you consume kind of has to be on you to a certain extent. This is something I'm doing with every episode and every guest. You can totally say no, it's fine, but I wanted to know if you'd be willing to make a pledge. It can be the smallest thing ever. Like...
Oh, any kind of a pledge.
Yeah, any kind of a pledge. Like, every time I find a reliable source, I will add it to an Excel sheet that is accessible to anybody in the public.
I mean, since we're putting this out there and talking about it, I will say to anyone out there who's watching, who, if you happen to bump into me in the world and you want to talk to me about your mental health journey, I will listen and I'll talk to you about mine.
Wow, that's a big pledge.
But I do that anyway. So, I'm just putting it on the record. So, talk to me about your problems.
Yay! I'm coming over.
Wow, that's you raised the bar very high here, Imran. I can't even remotely get anywhere near you. But this is my pledge. My pledge is to be kind to people around me, because I know that that's the single most powerful way I can promote the mental health of people near and dear to me. And for those who I don't know and want more information about mental health, to offer my email address, for example, for people to write to me, which I can then use to forward a very useful set of resources that through the people I work with in Sangath, for example, we've been able to build, and which therefore I believe I can trust and advocate to others too.
In the interest of your privacy, should we just put Sangath's website?
What a good idea. Thank you. I realized as soon as I said this that maybe I shouldn't have.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you, Ira,
Hey,
for
guys.
having protected my privacy. And absolutely, I will share through you the
Okay.
information that I think is extremely reliable for people who want more information about mental health.
Great. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, what a pleasure.
Hello, this is Ira Khan, and that was Call Me Hopeful with The Swaddle. To listen to more such episodes, subscribe to The Swaddle on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts from.